West Kootenay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to speak to Bill C-46 today, a bill that would change the criminal code in relation to offences related to driving under the influence of alcohol, marijuana and other drugs. This bill is essentially paired with Bill C-45, the bill that will legalize marijuana, so it's safe to say that it was meant to provide some comfort to Canadians concerned with the dangers of driving under the influence of marijuana, or THC, as much as it is about alcohol impairment. Now, the NDP clearly stands for deterrence to driving while impaired. Canada has a terrible record of deaths and injuries related to impaired driving. About 1,000 Canadians are killed each year in traffic accidents involving impaired driving. Now, others have spoken eloquently on that aspect of the bill, but what I want to spend most of my time here today talking about are the concerns around the difficulties in testing in any meaningful way for impairment by marijuana. I sat on the Justice Committee for one of the meetings set aside to considering Bill C-46, and we heard very interesting and compelling testimony around roadside testing for marijuana. We are all used to the concept of testing for alcohol levels through roadside breath tests. These tests produce results that accurately measure blood alcohol levels, and blood alcohol levels rise and fall in a predictable manner that relates closely to impairment. And we can therefore deduce impairment from alcohol blood levels and do that in roadside tests every day across the country. We have per se limits for alcohol impairment, usually 0.08 or 0.05% blood alcohol. Now, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana is THC, and it acts in a very different physiological way than does alcohol. Unlike what happens when drinking alcohol, THC levels rise very quickly in the blood when marijuana is smoked, and while those initial levels are high, the person may not be significantly impaired because the effects of THC occur when the THC leaves the blood and binds to fatty tissues in the brain. And THC binds to fatty tissues so strongly that blood levels generally drop very rapidly. So when impairment levels are high, THC levels in the blood are usually very low. So THC levels in the blood do not necessarily relate at all to the level of impairment. And impairment also differs significantly between alcohol and THC. Alcohol impairment involves a loss of motor control, hence the famous tests such as walking a straight line or standing on one leg. THC impairment instead affects faculties such as reaction time rather than motor control. People impaired by THC will often report that they know they're impaired, so some are more likely to decide not to drive, or they'll drive more slowly. Alcohol impairment has essentially the opposite effect, so drunks drive more recklessly. Now, I don't want to suggest that people under the influence of marijuana are safe drivers, just that we have to test for impairment in very different ways. In committee, we also heard from a toxicology expert that we can back extrapolate from blood alcohol levels measured at some time after an incident to assess the levels that would have existed at the time of that incident. We can't do that for THC. So if a driver is involved in an accident and was found to have some level of THC some hours after the fact, we can't with any scientific accuracy at all, any scientific certainty at all, know what the THC levels were at the time of the accident. And even if the levels were tested at the time of the accident, we have no way of relating those THC levels with impairment. Dr. Thomas Marcotte, an expert in testing for THC and impairment from the University of California at Davis, gave extensive testimony on these difficulties. He and his colleagues have found no way to usefully match THC levels with impairment. And he and others have found it's not only difficult to relate THC blood levels to impairment, but that regular users of marijuana will have chronic low levels of THC in their bodies, in their blood, with no impairment at all. And this is extremely problematic for the task of finding a meaningful way to test for THC impairment on the roadside. We're making it legal for Canadians to use marijuana. Indeed, it's already legal for users of medical cannabis. And if some of these law-abiding Canadians have chronic low levels of THC in their blood, we use some per se limit of THC as a surrogate for impairment, then we're essentially saying that, yes, you can legally use marijuana or medical cannabis, just don't ever drive again, or you could be charged with impaired driving despite not being impaired. And also at committee, we heard from 2 witnesses from the Australian police forces. Australia has used extensive roadside testing for alcohol and drugs, and others have mentioned it in this debate. Much of this testing is through what they call booze buses that process hundreds of thousands of Australians annually. They literally close off highways and test everyone for alcohol levels, while a smaller sample are screened for drugs. And Australian police also carry out so-called random testing at their own discretion, usually in neighbourhoods that they feel need scrutiny. And it's this type of testing that the NDP has great concerns about, as it clearly is open to racial profiling. My colleague from Victoria on Friday covered some of these concerns very well in his speech earlier, so I'll leave that point here, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it from my colleagues later today. But one of the serious issues around Bill C-46 is that it undermines the present system of testing only after reasonable suspicion of impairment. The Australian police also testified about the tests they use for THC. These tests are very expensive, about $30 for the preliminary test and 10 times more for a secondary test given to those that score positive. If anyone is found with any level of THC, they're charged with impaired driving and have license suspensions. Now, this works in a jurisdiction such as Australia, where marijuana is illegal. As we've heard from the experts at committee, these people who use marijuana regularly, and there are many across Canada, including thousands who use cannabis for medical reasons, will have chronic levels of THC in their blood. If they lived in Australia, they would not be able to drive at all for fear of being charged for impaired driving, even when they're not impaired, even if they hadn't used marijuana for many hours or even days. So how do we test for marijuana impairment? As I mentioned before, THC impairment presents as a slowing of reaction times and other similar faculties, not a loss of motor control. Dr. Marcotte testified that he and others were working on developing iPad-based tests that would test for these abilities. But we hear from the government side here in this debate that they're confident that meaningful roadside mouth swab tests will somehow be developed in the next few months, despite expert testimony that any test measuring THC will be meaningless as a measure of impairment. And if we use the Australian model, we'll be criminalizing marijuana users who have chronic levels of THC in their blood, even though they haven't used marijuana that day and are in no way impaired. So we need a better solution to this problem. On July 1st next year, Canadians will be able to use marijuana legally, and many will be using and driving. We need a system that tests for impairment from marijuana, not for meaningless THC levels. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think it's important for us to recognize that we do need to modernize legislation. All of us are very much aware of the election platform. A commitment was given with respect to cannabis. And we've had, at the very least, 3 political parties, and Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, who have really wanted to move forward on this particular issue. And in order to do that, the responsible thing to do is to bring in legislation that would enable our law enforcement agencies and others to have part of the tools that are necessary to further advance the legalization of cannabis. And I'm wondering if the member across the way can just provide his thoughts specifically about how important it is that we do, in fact, bring forward and advance the legislation given the election platform and the commitment that was given by more than one political entity inside the House of Commons.
The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for his question. You know, I am very much in favor of the legalization of marijuana, but I'm also concerned, as I think all Canadians are, about the safety of Canadians on the road and impairment while driving. What I'm concerned about in this bill, and what I've heard from the other side, is that the government is prepared to go ahead using per se limits for THC levels in the blood and relate that to impairment. And What we heard in the Justice Committee is that simply can't be done, and if we do it, we'll be criminalizing people who are not impaired or posing no threat to other motorists and who are acting legally under the law, and that we've made marijuana legal, or we will have within a year. So that's my concern, is that we have to test for impairment rather than for THC levels. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his pointing out that, in fact, there is no test for impairment for THC. And I think he's highlighted a couple of the concerns where people who use medical marijuana legally, you know, would be in their system, and so there would be court challenges on that. But also, I think he missed a point where secondhand smoke is also of concern, and there may be people who are exposed to others that are smoking marijuana when it's legal that could have it in their blood, and they could also be falsely tested. The government talks about how they're always fact and evidence-based. The science shows there's no test that can show impairment for THC. So could the member comment on those people that may be impacted by secondary smoke?
The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to thank the member from Sarnia-Lambton for her comments. And yes, I mean, there's issues around secondhand smoke as well. It's not something that comes into debate when we talk about alcohol, for instance. It's a very different situation. But what I and other Canadians, I think, are concerned about with the legalization of marijuana is this issue around now we have to test for impairment. And I think the real issue is developing a test for impairment that actually does that. And it's clear that we can't do it with per se limits for THC. So we have to look at developing these other tests. As I say, people are working on it. I don't know, and I got the impression from the testimony at committee that this wouldn't and couldn't be ready in time for, within a few months. So that's something we have to consider before bringing C46 forward. Thank you.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat.